Hi, this is Sam Weigel with V1 Rotate for Flying Magazine, and in this week's episode, we're going to talk about flow-through agreements. So, you're getting ready to take the next step of your career. You have your commercial and instructor licenses, perhaps even a restricted ATP. You've been hard at work building your hours and making yourself more attractive to potential employers. Maybe your goal is a major airline, maybe something else. But you have noticed that the regional airlines are very interested in your particular set of skills and are willing to pay for them. In fact, these guys won't leave you alone. They're mailing flyers to your home, they're popping up in Google and Facebook ads, they're even doing crazy shit like sponsoring a MiG-17 at Oshkosh. So, who do you pick? The short answer here is that if you've been doing a good job of networking, you know pilots that work at these airlines or have worked at them and getting their opinion of the good and the bad and the ugly. Wait, you haven't been networking? Well, guess you're going on airlinepilotforums.com and getting a bunch of anonymous angry pilot opinions.
Dude, this place sucks. Why do you want to work for a regional airline? Do you hate your family? Anyone who comes to work here for anything less than envoy pay is pretty much a scab.
Jokes aside, most of the regionals do actually suck to a greater or lesser degree. They're just paying you really well for the moment to grin and bear it. Any flying job will suck a lot less if you live in base. So my advice is to choose a regional with decent pay and bonuses whose most junior base is a place to which you won't mind moving for a few years.
Envoy is the subsidiary wholly owned regional airline for American Airlines.
At Envoy, you have a no interview guaranteed flow-through program with American. Whenever you come and fly for Envoy, there is no more interview required to fly for American.
Yes, another thing to consider, the sweetener. Several legacy major airlines have established flow programs with their wholly owned regional partners to help them recruit qualified pilots like yourself, and equally important, to help manage their attrition rate. There are currently flow-throughs from Envoy, PSA, and Piedmont to American, and from Endeavor to Delta, though several other flow agreements are rumored, and there are a number of preferential hiring programs that have become near flows. So what exactly is a flow-through agreement? Basically, it looks like this. Major airline ABC establishes an agreement with regional airline XYZ that says whenever ABC is hiring, they will reserve a specified number of new hire slots, let's say 20 a month, for XYZ's pilots. XYZ pilots flow to ABC in seniority order, and there's usually a tacit agreement that ABC will not poach XYZ's pilots outside of the flow. There's no interview to flow, you just show up at your assigned new hire class. Once there, you're the same as any other ABC Airlines new hire, starting over at year one pay and seniority. This arrangement can be advantageous to all parties, though as we'll see, it's not quite as good of a deal for pilots as you might think. The regional airline gains steady, predictable attrition, at least to the partner airline, which they can use to better plan their staffing needs. They also use the flow to attract new pilots, with the prospect of steady advancement and a timely upgrade, and the eventual promise of an easy promotion to mainline without jumping through any additional hoops. The major airline loses some control of their hiring process, but in return gains the assurance that their regional partner will be able to staff their flights. They also gain a steady pipeline of experienced pilots who are familiar with their system. For pilots, flow-through agreements provide a degree of career predictability. It's simple math. You just take the number of eligible pilots that are ahead of you, divide by the number that are going per month, and assuming that the major airline continues hiring, you know when you'll be in class, without worrying about interview prep or stressing that you'll blow your shot on the big day. You might be surprised to learn that flow agreements have a long and somewhat sordid history in the airline industry. Back in the 1980s, just after deregulation, the first regional airlines flew small turboprops and initially code-shared with multiple major airlines. As the hub and spoke system evolved, however, the majors realized they needed to secure small gauge feed for their hubs, and many started up or purchased wholly owned regionals. One of these was Pan Am, which purchased Ransom Airlines in 1986. When they did so, they put Ransom's pilots on the Pan Am seniority list and put in place a flow agreement whereby a certain number of Ransom pilots could transfer to the Pan Am certificate every month with pay longevity and seniority intact. If Pan Am had survived and other airline unions had followed suit, the airline industry and the piloting profession would look very different today. Instead, what evolved was a two-tier system. Regional pilots and major airline pilots worked at separate companies, on separate seniority lists, under very different contracts. Regional pilots worked for markedly inferior pay and work rules in order to build the flight time necessary to get hired at a major airline, where they would start over at year one pay and seniority. This situation got a lot more complicated in the 1990s when Canadair and Embraer invented the regional jet. These jets gave a huge competitive advantage over turboprops, but outsourcing their flying required major airline pilots to change the scope clauses in their contracts. This was hugely controversial at the time and continues to be so. At two airlines, Continental and American, company and union came together with an agreement that allowed a certain number of RJs to be operated by wholly owned subsidiaries on the condition that flow agreements were put in place. These were two things actually: flow up agreements, where regional pilots could flow up to the main line in times of hiring, and crucially, flow down agreements, where major pilots would flow back to the regional in times of furloughing. This was seen as a way to mitigate the RJ's impact on mainline jobs while providing an eventual reward to regional pilots for working for lower wages. Neither agreement anticipated an event as catastrophic as 9/11 and the subsequent financial fallout, in American's case, right after buying TWA and its 3,000 pilots. At both American and Continental, hundreds of furloughed pilots flowed down to American Eagle and Co-X, resulting in the furlough of hundreds of pilots at those airlines. But later, when the furloughs were recalled and it came time to flow up, Continental spun off Co-X as ExpressJet and canceled the flow agreement. At American, meanwhile, the flow-up was considerably delayed and ended up tied up in litigation until 2011. When I was hired at Compass Airlines in 2007, they were the brand new bastard child of the Northwest Airlines bankruptcy, and as part of that, had a flow up and flow down agreement with Northwest. Now, the history of flow agreements up to that point was not a promising one, and the existence of the flow was a net negative for me when I accepted the job. If you had told me then that we would go through a major recession, Northwest would merge, the retirement age would get raised, Compass would be spun off to Trans-States, the flow agreement would be renegotiated twice, and not only would I not lose my job through all that, but 7 years later I'd find myself sitting in new hire class at one of the world's largest airlines without ever having interviewed for the job, I would have called you crazy. But that's exactly what happened. Now, despite my luck, the Compass flow wasn't a complete success story. When Compass was sold to Trans-States in 2010, the flow up was canceled, but all current pilots were grandfathered in. The flow down remained in place for all future pilots. Mesaba had a similar flow agreement to ours, and it was also canceled when they were sold to Pinnacle, but only a portion of their pilots were grandfathered in. It wasn't until American was trying to wring concessions out of PSA and Piedmont and Eagle in 2014, on the cusp of a pilot shortage, that the flow craze was renewed. And when Compass closed its doors in 2020, it was the loss of the flow down and the associated contractual reduction of 36 large RJs that made Delta change their tune. They abruptly signed a flow agreement with Endeavor and successfully argued in arbitration that it was the same thing that Delta pilots had agreed to in 2010. You can see that flow agreements have always been a bit of a carrot that management uses to get what they want out of regional pilots or major pilots or both. The thing is, though I lucked out flowing up to my employer at the start of a hiring wave, today I'm not sure I would go someplace that had a flow agreement with my dream airline. The reason is, you're stuck waiting in line behind everyone else, potentially spending several years in the left seat of a regional airliner at a time when a bunch of turbine PIC isn't necessary. That's potentially thousands of seniority numbers with follow-on effects for the rest of your career. Honestly, I would go to Piedmont or PSA or Envoy mostly if I wanted to fly for United or Delta. They're happy to poach American's pilots. And similarly, I went to go to Endeavor if I wanted to work for Delta. There are, of course, a lot of other hiring programs and career pathways in place and in the works. These include various cadet schemes, preferred hiring agreements, mentorship programs, and so on. We'll cover these in future episodes of V1 Rotate. Thanks for watching. For more great content for new and aspiring professional pilots, join me here at flymag.com every first and third Friday of the month.